Good morning, church. Can everybody hear me? I'm Phil Carey Jr., and I'd like to welcome you to our annual Religious Liberty Sabbath. We're going to have a panel this morning. It's meant to be interactive. I could have the panelists join us. We welcome and encourage questions and queries. You can tweet your questions to the hashtag above, TAFREGLIB 2018, TAF Religious Lib 2018. Those of you that are not adept with Twitter, find a friend or a neighbor and relay your question to them and have them tweet to that hashtag, and they will put it up on the screen so the panelists can react to it. Want to start out with allowing the panelists to introduce themselves. Many of them probably need no introduction, but we will allow them a brief introduction, and then we will get right to it. So we'll start with Ms. Eleanor here.
My name is Eleanor Collins.
I'm Matt Stockdale.
I'm Reed Christman.
All right, so we have these fine individuals, and like I said before, we'll start out with some topics that we had discussed before, and we'll kind of open it up during that process and wait for questions to roll in. But I would like to begin the discussion with some interesting information that I found in preparation for this Sabbath. Many of you may have been aware that there's been a change in administration the last year or so, and we are now a year and a half into the Trump administration, and there has been a few tangible changes, one of which is the Division of Health and Human Services, and they have a website as well. It's the government website that they put up outlines their policies. So I was perusing that in preparation for this event, and I found something pretty interesting that I'll read. The Conscience and Religious Freedom Division has been established to restore federal enforcement of our nation's laws that protect fundamental and unalienable rights of conscience and religious freedom. OCR is the law enforcement agency within HHS, that's the Health and Human Services, that enforces federal laws protecting civil rights and conscience in health and human services and the security and privacy of people's health and information. The creation of this new division will provide HHS with the focus it needs to vigorously and effectively enforce existing laws protecting the rights of conscience and religious freedom, the first freedom protected by the Bill of Rights. So what that kind of says in sum is that they are creating a division to help enforce religious liberty and freedom of conscience, particularly as it relates to health and human services, which would, of course, reflect on hospitals and other service-oriented agencies. So I guess that'll be my first topic for the panel. What do we think about this creation and empowerment of this new division? And I'll start with my immediate left here, Ms. Eleanor. Do you have any thoughts on the creation of this division? What does it sound like to you?
I think it could be both good and bad, positive and negative as well. The positive side is heretofore we have not really considered those who have had to use their conscience and perform certain medical procedures that they didn't agree with.
Okay.
But this kind of includes them too. If I were a nurse and if I was a nurse and I had to perform a particular procedure that my conscience didn't agree with, I would be very ambivalent in my decision. By the same token, whenever the government interferes or enacts or enforces some law, it becomes law at that point. And when people begin to go contrary to that law, then they begin to run into problems. One of the ones that I really thought about that is really very controversial, and it's not for the purpose to bring up controversy, but abortion is one that is very emotional And it's emotional from a female as well as a male standpoint, from the family standpoint. So if one had to perform that type of procedure and they didn't agree with it, their conscience would be in conflict. So those are some of the things that we have to consider when we look at the conscience laws.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Mr.
Do I
My
have any
thoughts.
thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Oh, I got lots of thoughts on that, yes.
Enlighten us.
The Seventh-day Adventist hospitals in North America have been performing abortions for decades.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Expound.
If a person meets a certain qualification for abortion and they desire to have one, the hospitals have done that. The Seventh-day Adventist Church takes a very ambivalent position on abortion. If you look up on internet, look up Seventh-day Adventist position on, use the word position on abortion, you'll see several things listed there. And in the General Conference, they have a listing that is about 3 pages long. And the listing will say that basically that it's up to the individual to choose. If you choose not to perform one, if a physician in a Florida hospital, for instance, chose not to perform one, he wouldn't have to, but somebody else would. So it's an individual decision, but the church takes really no stand as to the ultimate. They discourage it, but in some cases, but they take no ultimate stand.
I think that's an interesting point you bring up, because again, in preparation for this, I perused some of those websites that you were mentioning, and I could find no clear stance, at least from a policy standpoint, as to what the policy on this and several other issues actually was. So just by way of background, Reed, how long have you been affiliated with the Adventist Church?
All my life, 70 years, 76 years.
Wow. So during your time with the church, have you found this to be the case? In other words, these positions are kind of known and embedded, but not really explicitly articulated? Is that kind of?
Yes, because it's kind of a danger to articulate them. Our medical school teaches that the fetus is not a child until the embryo is not a child until it becomes a fetus.
And you're referring to Loma Linda?
Loma Linda, yes, our medical school, and a number, and that's kind of a broad-based position among the medical schools, I believe.
That's certainly interesting to me. I didn't know that. One thing I wanted to follow up on your point, Reed, the website, the government website, the HSS website, allows for exemptions under moral convictions. And it says it just as I had described. There's no detailed or articulated position as to what would constitute a moral conviction or what would need to be shown for a person to receive a moral conviction exemption. So that would allow individual providers of any healthcare facility to make a moral objection to a course of treatment or care and to refuse to provide that service to an individual. And it could cover something like abortion, but it might cover other things that have nothing to do with abortion. Can anybody think of anything in a situation where a person might have a moral conviction about providing care to a patient or a client in a hospital setting?
Well, I heard yesterday with Dr. Adrian Rogers on WHPE, and he was talking about people who worked for institutions, hospital institutions, and if they had to perform certain procedures that were in direct conflict to their moral beliefs, that they suffered. They began to suffer greatly, and not only would it affect their moral conscience, but also it affected their health as well. So if someone particularly continued to do this over and over again, it could have some type of health ramifications.
Any other thoughts on that, Matt?
I think you also have Jehovah's Witnesses, who oftentimes the parents will decide what treatment is appropriate for their children. So in a situation like that, if you had a physician who is a Jehovah's Witness, could that physician then say, I'm not going to immunize any children? And at that point, where do we get to? Do we get, certainly we get community health standards that might be in violation by a physician refusing to make that type of decision.
And before we go on, I also went in on Walla Walla General Hospital's abortion website, and they were very definitive in terms of when they think or when they feel that abortion is appropriate. And some of the things that they listed was the age of the viability, which would be the fetal development, the lethal congenital defect, if it's incompatible with life and shortly after the child dies or dies at birth, elective abortions, abortions with or without medical justification, incomplete abortion, abortion in which some products of conception have passed, but a portion usually remains in the uterus, the induced abortions, missed abortions, spontaneous abortions, and threatened abortions. So they did list some of the times that they thought was appropriate. And as I mentioned to you earlier, my mind goes back to if we're considering a child. Biblically, the scriptures say, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So we should train our children as opposed to giving them an early out or a quick out. We should train them over and over. In Deuteronomy, it says we should train our children when they lie down, when they raise up, when they walk by the way, that we're to completely and continuously train them in the way they should go. And I know there are exceptions. I know there could be adults, and I know that particular text may or may not apply in every situation. But as it relates to a child, we are continuously supposed to train our children.
Okay. Well, I think what you mentioned goes to a question that we have tweeted up above. Are those abortions for any reason or medically recommended for the safety and maternal health and safety? Maternal health being the health of the mother. And I think some of the exemptions, at least as Walla Walla has articulated, recognizes the various degrees and circumstances under which abortions in that facility would be considered. Somebody else had a...
When I was the dean of men at Southern. I was assistant dean, associate dean, and head dean at Southern between 1979 and 1987. And in 85, there were 3 abortion clinics in Chattanooga at the time. And in 1985, 20 Southern girls had abortions.
Wow.
At one of those clinics. I don't know about the other 2, but I do know that particular one. And so people are going to get abortions. Young girls are going to get abortions, illegal or not legal. And that was the focus of Roe versus Wade discussion. Now, I am not for abortions at all. I believe that a child is a child at conception, and I don't approve of abortions. However, I do recognize the fact that we live in a sinful world, and that is part of the reality of it. And if they're going to have it, I want it to be done as safely as possible.
I want to return to a point that Matt raised that I think I definitely don't want to be to gloss over, because we're talking about abortion and some of these reproductive matters, but I think he raises an interesting issue about the vaccinations. Many of you would have heard in the news that there's a contingent of people that believe that certain vaccines cause autism or other childhood maladies. And I think he raises an interesting point that if a hospital or a provider believed or had a set of beliefs that were incompatible with kind of general healthcare standards, and they believed really that it might be harmful to children to get a vaccine for measles or mumps, I believe under the policy, the way it's stated on the website, it would give them an exemption not to provide vaccines. And that's certainly something I hadn't thought about. So when you have kind of vague language that allows an out for people to kind of pick and choose what type of medical treatments they think would be necessary to be provided, it may have unintended consequences that have nothing to do with reproductive health, but it may allow people to say, look, I don't feel comfortable doing these vaccines anymore.
Does the government have an interest in having its rules practiced in our hospitals when we take government money?
Well, so now you throwing a question. Now you're gonna have to answer. I mean, what the general rule of thumb is that the independent practitioner has the ability under the medical standards and guidelines to provide a course of treatment that's medically necessary. That would be the general rule of thumb. However, if the government now is involved in that decision-making process, it does muddy the waters as to how much autonomy the actual provider has, because they're saying on the one hand, yes, you're independent, but on the other hand, they're saying we can then influence how you exercise your independence, which doesn't sound like independence to me, but I'm just a moderator. Go ahead.
I also wonder whether that would open up a legal defense as an attorney. Think about this. Would that open up a legal defense to a doctor who refused to give vaccinations?
Absolutely.
Could he then use this statute from Health and Human Services to say, I don't have to, and you can't sue me because I did that. If your child gets sick because they didn't get a vaccination, I have protection.
Absolutely. I can't say as to whether or not it'd be successful, but it's definitely providing grounds for defense. Another area I thought of, and some people in the audience may be old enough to remember this, there was a time when unaccompanied women that were not married or women did not present with a male figure, could not get certain types of reproductive care or health care advice from a doctor. Might that return something to that standard? In other words, if a young lady comes in and asks questions and the doctor doesn't feel comfortable providing advice or care to her by herself, might he say under a religious or a moral exemption, I don't feel like talking about matters of sex or reproductive health with single women? So again, I think you're raising the unintended consequences of allowing people to say, I don't really want to do this because I don't like the way it makes me feel.
And just to give you some additional statistics, Dr. Rogers brought out that he had spoken to a physician that was in the abortion business, and he said within a 2-year period, he had performed over 60,000 abortions.
Wow.
And when I thought of that, I said, that's enough for a city, you know? And his staff began to really suffer all kind of anxiety attacks and different health issues because of that.
Well, anything else on that before? Okay, so we have another question. Will the non-recitation laws be effective with the new agency that was created? I think what the question is driving at is where you have a do not resuscitate, or a person expresses wishes through a durable health care power of attorney that in the event of their incapacity, say they're in a coma or they have a traumatic accident, and they have left wishes that they do not want to be revived, might that fall under this edict that I just described? And that's another area I hadn't thought of that I think is pertinent.
I hadn't thought about that either, but yeah, if a doctor believes that you still have life at that point, the doctor could ignore the DNR and then again have protection and say, well, wait a minute, under a conscientious decision, I have protection to ignore your DNR, which I think is, I hadn't thought about that either, but that's an excellent question.
Or organ donation. I know some people have strong feelings about that. If a person had directed that their liver, heart, other organs be donated, but the person that was in charge of harvesting or otherwise procuring those organs said, I believe the body should be buried intact. And anyway, I think the point we're kind of illuminating is that each time we return to this issue, we think of another scenario in which a person could deviate from what would be standard medical practice and can get into a gray area.
The largest hospital organization in the world is Catholic.
That's right.
Catholic Church. And I think it's like 1 in 5 people in the world go to a Catholic hospital when they need one and are treated by physicians and nuns and people who have given their, what's the word I want there? They've signed a paper saying they will do nothing that does not coincide with Catholic doctrine. And one of the Catholic doctrines, you don't take life and you don't,
Right.
under any circumstance. And yet,
Microphone.
yeah, so what do we do about a situation like that?
Well, I think you
I mean,
make
the
an
Adventist,
interesting.
the Adventist hospital is the second largest, by the way, in the world, and it's not. It doesn't have a problem in those areas because it basically leaves the choice up to the physician and the hospital administrators, and does not take a moral stand. But the Catholic Church takes a moral stand. And in that vein, when I read the new policy, when I read it several times, and I even kind of outlined it and took the verbs and put them down on a column, and just to see what I thought of it. And the more I looked at it, the more I began to think this is a payback to the evangelical church for supporting President Trump. That's exactly what I thought. I may be wrong, but that's what I thought.
I don't
You
think
know,
you're
in
wrong.
looking at our hospitals and looking at some of these statistics, I was really amazed. But first of all, when we look at hospitals or any other agencies, the reason that they are in business is for a profit. That is the very first rule of business. And once we change our mindset, sure, it would be great if we had our hospitals that were just geared just to Adventists. But they put their sights beyond that because there are bigger fish to be gained in the lake as a result. So once we look at the first law of you're in business for for a profit, then that kind of changed your perspective a little bit. And the mission statement for one of the hospitals says, living God's love by inspiring health, wholeness, and hope. And their vision statement is what you plan to do down the road within the first 5 or 10 years. We will transform the health experience of our communities by improving health, enhancing interactions, and making healthcare more accessible. Then they look at their values. Their value system is what they plan to incorporate as far as a character of an organization is. They want to have integrity, they want compassion, respect, and excellence. And I looked at some of the hospitals, some of the numbers we have in our North American division. In California, in Central California, we have 5 hospitals. Northern California, 6. Southern, 5. Hawaii, 1. Northwest, 2. Hospitals and medical centers. Central Florida, we have 9. East Florida, Central Florida, we have 2. West Florida, 3. Central West Florida, 7. Mid-America, 1. Midwest, 5. Rocky Mountain, 5. Southwest, 5. Southwest, again, 5. Kettering Adventist Healthcare, 8. Loma Linda University, 6. And then we have a host of healthcare systems, hospices. So we are really growing as a health institution, and we are right behind the Catholics, if not ahead, as far as hospitals are concerned. But we know if we go back to our religious base, we know that hospitals is the right hand, or healthcare is the right hand of our belief system. So we're fulfilling God's commission by going out and attending for those who need health and administering good health and sound health to our population.
In 2008, we took $1.4 billion in federal money in our hospital system.
Wow. Well, let me muddy the waters further. If an Adventist institution wanted to provide Sabbath exemptions, in other words, either non-essential or personnel that worked within the Adventist healthcare system or hospitals a Sabbath off. In other words, the ability not to work during that time. Would they be able to claim a religious exemption, having taken that money that you described, having had the large scale and scope that Eleanor described, as far as these are not ones and twos and three, small outfits. These are large conglomerates, large businesses. Would they be able to justify an exemption for their employees not to work on Saturdays?
Not everybody.
What do you mean? Why not?
Got to operate the hospital. So you either got to, and you have, we haven't, so far the Adventist system has hired Adventist administrators, financial, economic officers. But workers, some physicians are hired that are not Adventists. Certain situations. They try to hire Adventists, but not everybody. You have an open, the government heretofore has wanted you to have an open process of hiring, and they advertise each position openly, and then look for try to pick the Adventist.
So are you saying conceivably that even in an Adventist institution such as a hospital, people may be required to work on Saturday because the basic functions of
If
the
you
hospital
have a
is-
PA that's an Adventist and an MD that's a surgeon and it's not an Adventist, even though the PA has watched a lot of surgeries and been involved in some of those, they've got to hire the PA who's not an Adventist. I mean the MD who's not an Adventist.
And the scripture says that it's
More
good to do,
qualified.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, because he's more qualified, I was going to say.
The scripture says that it's good to do good on the Sabbath day. And Christ healed the paralytic on the Sabbath. So we can't afford to close down a large institution or large institutions like that. But we can certainly set some guidelines, because that is the day of creation. That is God's Sabbath. He is the creator. So I think we can set more definitive laws. I know coming up as a kid, I've been an Adventist all my life. And my mom is a retired nurse, but they were told that if they worked on the Sabbath, they were to take that money and pay it as tithe. I think we have kind of moved away from that a little bit, but they were very firm in that belief. I don't know what the guideline is, but as far as the Sabbath is concerned, I think it should be some very strict rules and very strict laws. Naturally, we cannot close down our institutions or put it on pause until the Sabbath hours are over, but I certainly think they can address that issue just a little bit more fervently and aggressively.
You mentioned laws. In Connecticut, there actually was a law that would allow religious believers to have a Sabbath day off and require the employers to recognize that. The statute would give the employees a right to declare any day of the week their Sabbath, and they would not have to work. They would have to have a scheduling accommodation. What do we think about that Connecticut law?
I mean, I think when you first look at it, on first blush, you say, "Oh, that's awesome." Employers are required to give us a Sabbath off, and they have to make an accommodation. So I think at first blush, you think that's a really good idea. But actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, you start seeing some problems that can come into that. That when they say that they have to give you an accommodation, what if you are there's only 2 employees? That means the other person has to work every single time for your day. Or what if you're the only employee? Then the business has to shut down. So there are some accommodations that I think are unfair to a business to have to do. But I think you can also, you start, how far down the rabbit hole do you go? When you start thinking about, well, if you have to make an accommodation, that particular law says whatever your Sabbath day is. But let's be honest, the majority of people who have a Sabbath use Sunday as their Sabbath. You know, when you start to say that you have to make an accommodation, that's one step closer to a law being passed that says you have to take Sunday off. And so that's the danger when you have these laws. At first blush, they may look good, but I think they can be very dangerous at the end.
That particular law, wasn't it declared unconstitutional?
It was ultimately, but this current administration has expressed interest in having a national law that models it, meaning that, as you said before, the political base that helped elect Trump is very interested in allowing religious accommodation, by example, as Matt was saying, to allow Sabbath off. But as Matt was alluding to, we're talking about 51% or 55% of people worship on Sunday. What percentages do we think we're thinking about when we say people that worship on Sunday versus Saturday? Yeah, but by what proportion? By 55%, 60%? What percentage of the religious community does Adventists make in the United States? Everybody's got phone, everybody's got Google. Ask Siri. I can't do it, I'm on a microphone. I hear 1%. Anybody else have an idea?
Well, you got the Jewish community that worships on Saturday.
Well, they have a little bit.
You have some Sabbatarians that worship.
So what would you estimate would be the percentage kind of in the United States?
6 or 7%, maybe 10,
So
counting all the communities.
So at most 10, so we're talking about 90 to 10. So the chances are that the day that they would recognize would fall on your preferred day. So strictly Adventist observing Sabbath Saturday the way in which Adventists would recognize it would be 0.4%. So I think Matt makes an interesting point that when you read something and it looks like it might be beneficial, you have to think of it not in your own personal context, but in the larger context of what it would look like if it were nationalized. It would tend to skew towards.
I'm going to go out on a limb. If anybody gets anything out of this discussion, I think it should be that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a progressive denomination. It's been progressive from the get-go. Doctrine have changed. To give you an example of that, in 1872, when the series of beliefs showed up on the Review and Herald and was printed there, it had nothing about Ellen White. It had nothing about the Trinity. In fact, it was decidedly anti-Trinitarian. But in 1930, when we published our first set of beliefs since 1872, it had a decidedly Trinitarian and pro-Ellen White position. And in 80, we had 27 fundamental beliefs that were voted and published. And now we have 28 fundamental beliefs voted and published. So we're constantly progressing. The issue before our church, the dominant issue before our church recently is ordination of women as elders, not in the local church, but as pastors. Okay? That's a really, in truth, that's a dead issue in North America. I mean, even though there are certain forces that are strong, powerful forces that are opposed to that issue, it's really a dead issue because they are continually hiring ladies, and somebody is continually ordaining one or two of them every year. So they're going to, we are a progressive church. We are a church that is moving, changing, developing. We started from in 1863 when we got our name. We were 3,500 people strong throughout North America. hardly any in the South, by the way, but mostly in the Midwest and New England. 3,500 people, and now we're 20 million. We have more Seventh-day Adventists outside of North America than there are Baptists outside of North America. So we're constantly progressing and moving and changing.
I don't know.
And when we look at the birth of the Sabbath, which is in Genesis 2, verse 1, it says when God finished creation, he says he blessed the Sabbath day. He sanctified it, and he made it holy. So he is the creator. Now, if he doesn't mandate, he requires us to do it. In Isaiah, it says, from each new moon to another shall all flesh come together and worship. But he didn't say you better do it. So he leaves that open so that we are able to use our own will. And I go back to the law that you just read. Anytime the government comes in and mandates it, he can mandate something else too that is not in accordance to the will of God. So how will we respond to that? So we have to try to stay flexible and try to keep the government flexible so that we will be able to worship God as what our forefathers says, according to the dictates of our conscience.
I think Reed, hit on the point about the undercurrents of the origins of the Adventist church, and it wasn't that popular in the South. We have a tweet up on the board. The SDA is the only church that remains segregated. We do not ordain women. Are we progressive with a question mark? And I think that is a kind of tacit admission that when we were first formed, we weren't formed fully whole and fully functional and remain exactly the same from now until then. There has been dramatic change and progressive tendencies throughout the church to include more and more people, but it's an imperfect work. And we do have black and white conferences, black and white GC-funded colleges, and we mentioned the women's issue. So I do think it's a work in progress. Matt?
We are sinful people.
The interesting thing is, though, that the Adventist Church is also the most diverse religion that there is. When Pew Research did the study, we are the most diverse religion, but yet we are still segregated.
We're still segregated.
So even though we are diverse, we have a lot of work still to do. But one thing I was going to kind of bring back to the law, and that's one of the reasons why, as an Adventist church, why our legal department in the Adventist church files so many amicus briefs. We will.
Can you explain what the amicus brief is?
An amicus brief is, if there's a lawsuit going on, you can actually file a brief in support of one side or the other. And the Adventist church files a lot of amicus briefs in cases that you probably would say, why in the world are they filing that? I disagree with what they're doing. Because they will file amicus brief on behalf of other religions. But they do it in order to uphold religious liberty. If there's any potential religion that has a lawsuit being filed against them that would potentially damage religious liberty, if we go down that road, the Adventist church will support whatever religion that is. Doesn't matter which one, because the legal department of the Adventist church realizes how important religious liberty is, and it has to be upheld to the utmost.
The most famous case in that situation is the case of the Indian tribe in the Northwest who smoked peyote.
That's right.
And it came to the Supreme Court, and the Adventists sent a strong amicus brief for that, supporting the smoking of peyote.
That is correct.
For their
I
religious
remember
service.
that from school and having a twinge of pride reading that in school.
Employment Division versus Smith.
Employment
I just
so
thought
don't
that a
tell
couple
me
weeks
it's not
ago.
progressive.
And just a brief summary of that case, the peyote is a kind of a cactus-like substance that grows naturally and organically, and the Indians were using it in their religious ceremonies because it
Get
enhances
high.
their spiritual connection, they believe. But they're smoking and using this hallucinogenic herb. But the Adventist church was actually on the side of them being able to utilize it, as Matt said, not because they were promoting the use of these organic substances for hallucinogenic experience, but because of the principle of the choice of its members to engage in that religious practice. And I think that's an important point to make, that supporting the idea of liberty does not mean you're supporting the idea of what people do with that liberty. And those are two different things. Eleanor, you had a... Okay, we have a final tweet on the board. Probably we're getting towards the end here. What about Isaiah 46:3-4? Does God give us the will to decide for ourselves, or do we allow him to decide for us? And I think Eleanor was speaking to that earlier about the operation of free will in the context of the Lord allowing us to make these choices, and that being kind of a different, qualitatively different thing than the government mandating a certain set of behaviors. You had any more
What did
thoughts?
God
Go
do
ahead.
with Lucifer?
Oh,
Did
getting
he
deep in
abort
the
that-
panel,
did
Reed,
he-
towards the
did
end.
he- did he abort that relationship? Or did he allow it to
He
go
allowed
through?
it. He allowed
Yeah.
it.
So freedom of choice is extremely important to our God. That's one of the things that we really know for sure.
Well, next panel, Reed, I'll ask you, who put the tree in the garden? Because no one ever could answer that for me in Bible class. They ran me out, Reed. So I'm gonna have to ask you next panel.
They should have run you out.
All right, final thoughts from anybody before we wrap up. People want to. Eleanor, you had something you want to say?
I would just like to leave one scripture text, and that is as a nation. And it's found in Psalms 33. It said, "Blessed is a nation whose God is the Lord." And as long as we keep God included in our rules, our statutes, our regulations, our practices, and as long as we walk forward with integrity and good character building things, our nation can move forward and fulfill the commitment that God has given us as a nation to move forward in. Blessed is a nation whose God is the Lord. May the Lord continue to help us to be strong, to be committed to him in everything we do and say. Thank you.
Gentlemen, anything? Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate the panel. We're going to have, what do we have, spaghetti today? What do we have, Mom? No, she's in here somewhere. Spaghetti, I believe. Thank you for joining us.